My name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Dr. Irene Butter, PhD Dr. Emeritus in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. Well, we're very pleased to have you here today. We have several reasons why we'd like to have Dr. Butter with us today. The most important is we're going to talk as we go along on her book that is called Shores Beyond Shores. We're going to discuss this. This is about her life growing up in Germany and Holland during the horrible years of the late 30s and early 40s, particularly for folks that were victims of the Nazi regime. And that's what we'll be talking about, Shores Beyond Shores. But first, Dr. Butter, I'd like to start out with your arrival in the United States and tell us a little bit more about, after you've come a rather interesting trajectory to get here, tell us about your life once you arrived in New York with your mother and your brother.
Well, I did not arrive with my mother and my brother. I was alone. I was separated from my family, complicated. We were on a train from Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland, being liberated from the camp before the end of the war, and my father died on the train, and his remains were left in a small town in Germany. Then we arrived in Switzerland a couple days later, and my mother and my brother were so sick that they had to be hospitalized immediately, and the Swiss wouldn't allow me to stay with them. And they said they were full, they had too many refugees, and along with 100+ people who also came from Bergen-Belsen, we were sent to North Africa to a refugee camp in Algiers. And the war ended only 3 months later. So I spent almost a year in Africa, not being reunited with my mother and brother, as we both hoped. Came to America. I turned 15 on the ship, stayed with relatives who I'd never met before in Germany. They also were refugees. And, you know, to describe it briefly, life was wonderful and very difficult at the same time. Of course, coming to America had been my dream the whole year I was in Africa. And I had not had any schooling for 3 years, so I was very eager to go to school right away, which I did. My relatives were very loving and understanding and supportive. And then 6 months later, my mother and my brother arrived. There was a tremendous housing shortage in New York City. It took us 2 years to find an apartment, and only then did we start our life together as a family again. Now, of course, I should mention, we arrived homeless and penniless because everything had been taken away from us by the Nazis, and that made life difficult at first. Luckily, there were many opportunities for education, for work, for finding new friends. So it was a two-sided experience.
Well, that's interesting. And again, after you are finally reunited in New York, you go back to school. You've lost some years, obviously, given being in the camps. And somehow you decide, and I guess it's just one, you decided you wanted to study economics as an undergraduate. What was what specifically attracted you to economics as an academic discipline?
Well, first I had to go to high school, but then I went to a city college, and I always mention the fact that it was tuition-free, which makes a big impression on people today. I got a wonderful education at Queens College, and I started out with the idea of becoming a social worker, because so many times in my life I had been helped and supported by social workers, and I thought this would be the right way for me to go. But I didn't find the courses particularly interesting, which doesn't mean the field wasn't interesting, but it didn't attract me in college. And then I took an economics course and found that more relevant to my interest because it taught me more about what's really fundamental in society is how the economy runs and how fair it is and how resources get distributed amongst all people of the population. So I stuck with economics.
Well, and then I guess when you were studying economics, you met your future husband at the time. Is that correct? Also studying at Duke University.
Right. After graduating from City College, I attended Duke University to earn my PhD, and he was majoring in physiological psychology, and we finished up about the same time. My first job was with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and my husband was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institutes of Health, so we spent 3 years in that area and started our family, and then came to Michigan and been there ever since.
And again, at the University of Michigan, you worked in the School of Public Health. What kind of courses did you teach when you were in the School of Public Health?
Well, at that time, there was a new field, actually, in the early stages of development. It was called health economics, and it was about economics of the healthcare system and the many problems that we were facing and how to resolve them. So I taught courses in the School of Public Health. Almost all students are required to take a course in elementary economics. I taught that. I taught policy analysis, which is based on economics. And in the 70s, I became interested in women's health. So I taught a course called Race, Gender, Ethnicity, and Health, and several other courses. But they mostly had to do with my fundamental interests, which have to do with equity, access, equal opportunity, those kinds of issues.
Very interesting. Well, also around this time, you got involved in various activities and organizations on campus. Could you give me our viewers information on what motivated you to become involved with the Wallenberg lecture series and let our folks know who Raoul Wallenberg was, as well as the Zaytuna group? How did you get involved with these two organizations?
Well, it wasn't simultaneous, but the Wallenberg group, I found out at a certain point that Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swede, not Jewish, had made huge sacrifices and taken risks at the end of World War II, to accept a position with the Swedish embassy in Budapest. And that was the only place in Europe where a substantial Jewish population still existed. And so his goal was to save as many Jews as possible from the death camps, from execution. And I consider him the biggest World War II hero. The saddest, he used very inventive tactics. He made up something called Schutzpasse, which was fake Swedish passports to save people, and also safe houses, where it became Swedish property, and the Nazis were not admitted to those properties, and those were two methods. He also pulled Jews off the trains to Auschwitz. And the saddest, and he was very successful, he is known to have saved tens of thousands of Jews from being deported. And the sad part is that at the end of the war, the Russians entered Hungary and they captured him, and he was never seen or heard of again, probably executed within 1 or 2 years in the Soviet Union. And the irony is that the man who saved so many Jews, the world was not able to save him. And so that is a very tragic story.
Well, and I think again, the reason we have the Wallenberg lecture series at the University of Michigan is I believe Mr. Wallenberg was a student at the University of Michigan
Right.
at some point during the 30s. Is that right?
He was here and studying architecture from 1931 to 1935, and then went back and did some architecture. And then during World War II, he worked for a trading company, a Hungarian trading company, and traveled quite a lot within Europe. And that's how he ended up in this position. But at a certain point, it was in 1984 that I learned about him. He really was, there wasn't much information about him until the 80s. And I realized that the university had not ever really acknowledged his heroic deeds. So with some friends, we started a grassroots group to develop an endowment, and it took 5 years to raise enough money to start a program. And after considering a number of different ways of honoring him, we ended up with a lecture, an annual lecture, for which we would invite an outstanding humanitarian from anywhere in the world whose deeds resembled the courage and the risks taken by Raoul Wallenberg, and have that person come here. There's a Wallenberg medal. Person receives the medal, and the event would serve as a role model for our community. The motto is, one person can make a difference, because what Wallenberg did in Budapest, he did almost single-handedly.
Well, and then maybe the question would be, could you give us some of the names of the recipients of the actual Wallenberg Award that our folks might be aware of?
Yes, it really evolved into something beyond our expectations when we founded the endowment. We have given out 27 medals by now, getting ready for the 28th. And we have 5 Nobel Prize winners among the medalists, and they have been extraordinary people from many different walks of life, in many different countries in the world. And last year, you know, including the Dalai Lama and Bishop Tutu and Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar, and then there are other Nobel Prize. Most recently, one of our Nobel Prize winners, or one of our Wallenberg medalists who became a Nobel Prize winner, is Dr. Denis Mukwege from the Democratic Republic of East Congo, who is a very impressive person. And so I have had the privilege of welcoming these medalists and getting to know them a little bit during their visit, and it's been very enriching.
Oh, I can imagine. Could you also tell us a little bit about the Zaytuna, is that correct?
Zaytuna, right.
And what is your involvement with that, and what exactly function does that perform?
It is a group of 6 Palestinian and 6 Jewish women here in Ann Arbor who, we're a dialogue group. We meet every other week in our homes, starting with a meal, and address complicated topics. And actually, for 1 year, we didn't do dialogue. We didn't talk about the complex issues in the Middle East, but we just listened to each other's stories to get to know each other, to create safety and trust. And I think that was one of our recipes for success, is not to launch into the conflict, but to get to know each other. And our motto is refusing to be enemies. We've learned so much from each other. Most of us feel that we have transformed our own thinking in many ways, and I think we're now something like 16 years old, 17 years old.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, that kind of is just a brief introduction to some of the most amazing things that Dr. Butter has done in many years, but one of the things she did recently and has done recently is to give us all a wonderful book called Shores Beyond Shores, From Holocaust to Hope, My True Story, which is about her life that we're talking about. We're going to move into that now. But I think the one thing that I initially, these are events that happened several decades ago. And I guess my first question to you as it relates to Shores Beyond Shores would be, what was your motivation after many decades to all of a sudden say, I want to share this event? That apparently you hadn't, it wasn't something you had talked about very often, at least not, but what made you decide, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, what happened actually is when I first came to America, my relatives, and I've heard the same from many survivors who came here after the Holocaust, they told me, now you're here, you have to start a new life, you have to forget the past, never talk about it. And this led to 4 decades of silence, which is analogous to many people. The world wasn't ready to hear about the Holocaust for a long time. And so in the 80s, I began to talk. Various events prompted me. The first one was my daughter. She was in middle school taking a course in public speaking, and at the end of the course she had to do a speech, 1-hour speech. And the topic she chose was anti-Semitism, Hitler's conquest of Europe, and the concentration camps. And she came home and she said, Mom, will you be my visual aid? And so she wanted me to use 15 minutes of her 1-hour speech and talk about the concentration camps. And first I was petrified because I had never spoken, and I didn't know how students would react, but couldn't turn her down. So that was the first event, which went pretty well. And then in the late 80s, there was an Anne Frank exhibition that traveled throughout the country, and it came to Detroit, and I was invited to participate on a panel. And while I thought about this panel and what I would say, it dawned on me that Anne Frank couldn't be here, and her voice was silenced forever. But I was the lucky one to survive, and so I had to speak. I had to break the silence. And another influence on me was Elie Wiesel. He was a survivor himself, but a strong proponent of survivors' responsibility to be witness and to provide testimony and to speak, to tell the stories. So at that event in '87, the exhibition in Detroit, I started talking in schools, and I've talked more than 35 years now in schools every year. I recently went to a school in Canton, and they reminded me it was the 20th year that I had come to that school. So I think, to get back to your question, what motivated me to write the book, one reason is that I hope I can still talk for some years in schools, but when I cannot, then there is the book to tell my story. And also, it's increasingly important, I think, to tell these stories, because we live at a time when, first of all, many students don't learn that in their history classes. And it's very scary to think that history will repeat itself and that this will come to haunt us again. And so what we need to do is to be involved in action, social action, to defend the American values, to stamp down hatred, discrimination, persecution, do whatever we can so that it won't happen again.
All right. Well, I just wanted to read from your book. You were mentioning that you were Elie Wiesel, and what the direct quote that you have in the book is, "If you were there, if you breathed the air and heard the silence of the dead, you must continue to bear witness to prevent the dead from dying again. It's in your book.
Yes.
And it sounds to me that kind of this is your legacy to that specific thing. One of the things I think is fascinating for anyone who reads this book is the vivid portrayal of your life. And we're getting to this, everything from the sounds to the smells to the specific incidents. And these are events that are beginning from you at age 6, 7, going on to age 15. And some people, I have a hard enough time remembering certain things, from a month or two ago. But how were you able? These memories are so vivid. How did you access these, or were they always there? But just everything from smells to sounds, everything comes alive in your book. How did you grasp that part of this?
Well, I give a lot of credit to my co-writers, and they are very close friends. And we've known each other for a long time, and so at some point, a decision was made that they would help me. I actually started out with another kind of book because I have wonderful feedback from students over the 35 years. I have a huge archive of drawings and poems and verses and letters, and I wanted to share that with the world. And then my friends guided me into another direction. They said it would be hard to publish, and it's more important for me to tell my story. And they helped me put a lot of the student material on my website, so it's kind of, you can have your cake and eat it too. And so they started working with me, and we had numerous hours on Skype where I would tell an incident or an episode or something that happened, and then they would probe me, and ask a lot of questions to get more detail and to get more into depth of these experiences, and without them, I don't think it would have happened.
Well, and
they helped a lot, and also I have to give credit to the students, because whenever I go to a school, I leave time for Q&A, and I've had very penetrating questions from students, which also have helped me. Often the question will lead to a memory that was totally buried, I hadn't thought about in 20 years.
Well, and that does kind of lead me to ask that question too then. When you're doing these various Skype interviews and talking to, I think, John Bidwell and Chris Holloway or other authors working with you on the book, as they were probing these, a lot of these things they're in the past, but you've also moved on, you've had your life. Was that painful to bring up? How did you react to going back to this time when they would bring it up through these experiences?
Well, it often was very painful to open wounds, to open scars. And it took us 5 years to complete the book. And many times I had to take breaks. I just had to put it aside before going on. Yeah, it was painful, but I must add that in the end, I'm really pleased that we finished it and that it was a form of liberation to get it published.
Good. Well, as I said, we're not going to go too much into the book because we want you to actually read this on your own, but just to give us a synopsis of and there's so much in here, you really do have to read this, but the journey of horrors starts for your family probably around 1936, at least from your recollection. This is during the German Olympics. You're going into town and seeing all these red flags, which you categorize as zigzags, that you're seeing these all over, because I know that they made the town look wonderful for the international press.
Right.
Swastikas. But what fascinates me most is, and this is something that it's hard for all of us to understand, it's really just kind of a perception of almost like a slow-moving degradations that your family suffered. Your father can't work in a bank. You can't go to these places. And I'm just interested. And again, you're no child, but it's almost so insidious, the slow nature at which things are taken away from you. Can you describe that sense of this constant, I can't go, how that felt in this process?
Well, I was 7 when we left Germany to go to Holland. And so, I was a young child, so it wasn't so apparent to me. I remember one time, I was in first grade in Berlin, and one of the students had a birthday party and invited the whole class except one other girl, and myself, because we were Jewish. Everybody else was not. And that's certainly one thing I remember. And then when the Nazis took my grandfather's bank away, you know, he'd worked all his life to build this bank, and Jews could no longer own banks like many other businesses and enter professions. And so then life began to change drastically because my father was unemployed. And that's one reason he went to Holland to try to find a job, which he did, the American Express company in Amsterdam. And for 2 years, we had a pretty good life in Amsterdam before the invasion, of course, the Nazi invasion.
Right. Well, and of course, with that Nazi invasion comes more hardship for your family and unfortunately millions of others throughout the world. And one thing that comes clear is that while you're having various constraints placed upon your family, you're also now rounded up and taken to a place called Westbrook, Westerbork, which is kind of it seems to be more of a holding center, or there were things going on there. There was actually some activities. But one of the constant themes in your book, Dr. Butter, is the idea of food and not eating, and I really think, you know, this is not these are horrible places to begin with, but the constant struggle to feel full. You were not eating hardly anything. That must have been an overwhelming problem with just finding food and surviving. How did you deal with that?
Well, hunger. Right. I even this many years later, I haven't found language to describe hunger, because we use the word so often, you know, just casually. Kids come home from school and they're starved, right? And they go for the cookie jar or something like that. But it's very difficult to describe. It's something, you know, you're never not hungry anymore. And food is so limited and gets scarcer and scarcer. And I think that for the rest of my life, I've had effects. You know, I can't waste anything.
I can understand.
I am very cautious about food. And it's an experience you can't get beyond, really.
Of course. Well, and the other thing that I think people to understand that at the time that when you're first sent to Westerbroek you're how old? You're 11 or 12?
12.
12 years old. But unlike a lot of folks in the Holocaust, you were luckily enough to be with your family, your parents and your brother, your older brother Vernon. And that has a solace by design. Yes. But you're also still, you're young, you're optimistic about it. How did in spite of all the deprivations, your father's being forced to labor, you're working with younger kids, how did you hold on to the optimism as a family unit with all of this? How did you allow yourself to say there's an end to this, I guess would be my thoughts.
Well, it's something about hope. I don't think I was conscious of it then, but I think there's truth to it. Once you give up hope, you're going to go downhill, whether you know it or not. And so, to me, you know, I was young. I wanted to live. I had a dream about, I used to read these books about Heidi. Young girls were attached to that. And she was an orphan, and she went to live with her grandfather in the mountains of Switzerland, and she was skiing a lot. And that was sort of my dream. I held on to that if I survive, I want to go to Switzerland and learn how to ski. And I would see these pictures of mountains, snow-covered mountains in front of me. And I think, you know, there's been research about this. People who had a purpose or people who had a dream, a goal, were much more likely to survive than if you give up.
And that's interesting. And again, we're nearing the end here. I just want to, for most people going through this, we can't imagine the horrors here, but there are also other horrible people in this scenario that you interacted with. They weren't all Nazis. Some of these were what we would call collaborators, or depending on their situations. And my question is, there are people like Mrs. Mandel and others that were cruel and evil in their own ways. And how do you, and again, this is You told us that it's important not to forget the past so that we don't repeat something like this, which was just awful. But at the same time, how do you get to the point, do you get to a point of forgiveness? How do you evolve beyond the event and take a look at people who were so cruel to you and your family? Do you get to a point of forgiveness? Where does that leave you to go on after going through all this? Where would you say that?
Well, it's a complicated question, you know. It's very hard to forgive someone when that person is still mistreating you and being cruel. So it's more a question of afterwards. How do you feel about it afterwards? And, you know, I cannot forgive somebody for what they did to others. I can only forgive what somebody did to me, myself. And, you know, there's a side of forgiveness that's almost self-serving, selfish. Because if you have this anger and hatred inside yourself, it can eat you up. It can paralyze you. And so then you suffer from not forgiving. And so forgiveness helps you get over that, dismiss the anger and the feelings of hatred. So that's, you know, kind of one way of dealing with it, but forgiveness is difficult. And I couldn't say if Hitler was alive today, I don't know that I could forgive him for everything he did. That would be a big jump.
Well, that's more than understandable. Well, again, now that you've done such a remarkable career, you wrote this wonderful book. What is next for you? I mean, you said you continue to read. Are we going to see a follow-up to this? Are you ever going to think about maybe doing other things? Now that you're retired from the University of Michigan, any short-term plans or things that you... Did you ever go skiing in Switzerland?
No.
All right. Well, I mean, what do you hope? What should be on your agenda then for, let's say, the next couple of years?
Well, as much as possible, I want to continue to give talks, and particularly to young people. For one, they are the future, and for two, they're very receptive. At least that's been my experience. I've been so refreshed and surprised by how students embrace my stories. And I can connect with students. I tell them my story, they tell me their stories. They can kind of build a bridge and see some commonality in it. Everybody has some dark things happening to them in their lives sooner or later. And so it's been very rewarding, and I would hope to continue. And what's most important is to transmit certain messages. One of them that I emphasize is never be a bystander, and hoping that students will develop a social conscience and they will do away with them and me and recognize we're all human beings. We're made of the same fabric. We need to protect each other. We need to stand up for each other and defend each other when necessary. And that requires some kind of orientation, right? And if they don't get it at home and they don't get it in school, then I think this is an opportunity for me. Like, do an act of kindness every day, and everybody can make a difference in this world, whether it's a small thing or you can move on to larger goals as you do it, but just to form the habit of being kind to other people and to protest when things are happening that you don't believe in, that you don't support, that you want to eradicate. You have to be active. It isn't going to happen unless we fight. We fight for the good. We fight for American values. We fight for humanity and compassion and equality of human rights and human opportunities. And I believe it's really important for young people to learn this early in their lives. And I always wish I could see these students 10 years later and see if they still remember, but I hope they do.
Dr. Irene Butter is the author of Shores Beyond Shores. I want to thank you very much for being a guest today on
Thank
A2
you.
Insight. We're going to give you an address where you can purchase a copy of yourself. It's a wonderful read. I would highly recommend anyone to take a look at it, and it's a magnificent read. Thank you once again for being on A2 Insight. And for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trust.